because what this ultimately creates is a shared narrative. And what that shared narrative informs is how you perceive the world, right? And for you and I to communicate, we need to perceive the world the same and different at the same time. Now, that may sound paradoxical, but we need to agree on certain fundamental things, certain fundamental goals, let's say, right? And then we need to discuss how to achieve that goal. And this occurs and matters within a relationship with one other person. It matters between a familial unit. It matters between, a block in a community at large, a state, a nation, all of these things. And I think that we need to be gathering at a number of these different levels to try and align these narratives together. And this can be done in a whole host of ways, but I think a critical aspect to it is being in person, at least to a degree, around a lot of other people and having that shared experience. And I think, like I said, this needs to occur at a number of different levels. So, like, it's critical for, like, a couple to go out on dates even when they have kids, right? Which is actually some of what Jordan Peterson was talking about while we were on our date to Jordan Peterson, right? And a family needs to go out and have shared experiences together, whether that means going on a vacation or going and picking out a Christmas tree together, or going down to a supermarket, going to a farmer's market and picking out things after church, going to church together, whatever it is. A family needs to have these shared experiences. And then I think also, and this is really, I mean, you see this degrading at all of these levels, but I think particularly where I've seen it degrade is on like a block and community level. I remember when I was a kid going house to house, knocking on people's doors on, a Friday night in the summer at 6:30, letting everyone know, hey, we're gonna have a bonfire in the backyard. Feel free to stop on over. If you can, bring your folding chair. We've got some blankets. We got s'mores. Bring your kids. And we invited all sorts of people. Whether it was neighbors a few doors down that were retirees who had their kids out of the house, or it was neighbors a couple doors down that had like toddlers. Everyone was invited. And we told people too, like at the beginning of the summer or whenever people would move in, hey, if you see a fire in our backyard, feel free to stop on by. You're always welcome. And that's not something that I see people really doing. And obviously every community is going to differ a bit. But bringing neighbors together for shared experiences on, a somewhat regular basis. I'm not saying it has to happen every week or every month, but even a few times a year, even that makes all of the difference. My parents would throw like a Halloween party. A bunch of houses in the neighborhood could come down to my parents, and kids who were trick-or-treating could get a bunch of candy at one house instead of having to go house to house every time. And people could come on over and we'd have cider for the parents, and we'd have muffins and treats and things like that. And we had tons of people over all the time, and people who we wouldn't normally talk to, or they'd be out of town for all of the winter and you wouldn't hear from them, we'd get to see and we get to have a great chat with, and you'd have that level of like camaraderie.
How much of that do you think is like a personality thing though? Because like your parents are both pretty outgoing. They really like hosting people. They're very hospitable people. And my experience growing up in the neighborhood I grew up in was a lot different than that.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the same type of like close, tight-knit neighborhood, block parties kind of thing. I'm sure part of that is probably because like both my parents are quite introverted. My whole family is. And so I like that's not to say that my parents, weren't hospitable people, but like how much of this is a personality thing? Like your mom is like always inviting people over, always like hosting things, having parties, this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a personality aspect to it. I'm not denying that in any way. And I'm not necessarily saying that every single person needs to host something, right? Because not everyone on the block can host a Halloween party. Not everyone on the block can have a bonfire every night, right? Because then nobody would be coming to the actual bonfires. Everyone would just be having their own bonfires or Halloween parties or whatever you want to say it is, right? So I'm not saying necessarily that everyone needs to take this on themselves, but there were other things where, like, my mom would get together with all of kind of the women around the block, right? And it was just kind of like a ladies' night kind of thing. And that rotated house to house. My mom didn't host that every single time. Plenty of other people did.
Yeah, I guess I think what I'm pushing back on a little bit is the idea that this needs to be, like, specifically your neighborhood or where you live. Because, kind of like I said, my experience in the neighborhood I grew up in was a lot different than that in terms of, like, a neighborhood vibe. But
Sure.
that's not to say I didn't have tight-knit communities. Like, the church that I grew up going to was, a very small church, total, like, a couple hundred people, maybe. And there was a really tight-knit group of people within that church where, everyone knew everyone.
Sure.
The families, it was like a small Baptist church, right? So if you know kind of the stereotypes about the Baptist church, it's Sunday potlucks and luncheons and that kind of stuff, and that was totally my experience growing up. So like the people that we hung out with on New Year's Eve, on Halloween, like it was our church group, but that wasn't necessarily just based on our community that we lived in, like our neighbors.
Sure.
It was our church.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say to that is you can have different at these various levels. You can have engagements of different extents, right? So the extent of the engagement with my neighbors when I was young was very high. There were a lot of kids my age and my sister's age in the neighborhood, and I grew up in a neighborhood where there were a lot of families and young kids. So that meant people wanted to kind of get together a lot with their kids. I can imagine an area where the age of those living in the area varied pretty drastically, and as a result, that area not having the same level of community engagement. But to your point, I think the level of engagement in the community that you had at your church was more than I had.
At a church?
Yeah.
Yeah,
At
for
a church.
sure.
Right.
And
so,
I would even argue more so than you had in your neighborhood. Probably.
yeah, maybe.
But I mean, there was a large handful of families that all had kids. Around the same age. When I was going to that church, I always had good friends who were around my age. I was kind of on the younger end of the mass of kids that was all, in the same youth group and
Sure.
Sunday school together and everything. But like that was the community that we hung out with. We weren't family friends with, other kids I went to school with or other people in our neighborhood. It was our church friends.
Sure. But so to kind of flip this around, you said, oh, we never did anything in the neighborhood. I've heard plenty of stories from when you were young kids, like young, of you guys playing baseball in the street, hanging out with the neighbor kids.
Sure.
I've heard plenty of things where you're going and playing on the other neighbors' jungle gyms and stuff, okay? And the flip side, like I kind of talked about this earlier, but later on, once I got past the required youth group portion and started going to the optional youth group stuff at my church, there was an absolutely phenomenal community of people who willingly showed up every single week, where we had fun celebrations for Easter and Christmas and New Year's and things like that, where every week people were getting together in community, doing fun activities and games, talking, hanging out, on top of like going to leaders' houses at times and getting together on more spontaneous on a more spontaneous basis. So my point is, yes, the extent of your church community was higher than mine, but I still had a church community. And the extent of my neighborhood community was definitely more than yours, but you still had one.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'm just saying, like, you started this out by saying the place that you see this lacking these days is in those communities of, like, neighborhoods. And my only thing was, I don't think it needs to be a neighborhood.
So what I'm saying is, I think that it's lacking in a number of facets. So, and I was kind of starting at the bottom up. So I think that it's lacking on an individual relationship basis between like spouses, between couples. I think that it's lacking on a familial basis, right? Like my family always made a, always made it a point to sit down together at dinner and eat as a family. It didn't matter if somebody had baseball practice or dance practice after or whatever it was. My family sat down together to eat dinner. Okay? My understanding is that the general population in America where we live does not do this with their family. Similarly, I think most people, and I want to be clear, I'm just as guilty, I'm guilty of plenty of these things as well. I don't think that we have a great relationship with our neighbors, not because we've done anything wrong or they've done anything wrong, but just because we've not put in the effort to engage with some of those things. Yeah. And I think that that's lacking. Just like I think that the relationships that your family had with the neighbors were kind of lacking to a degree. And the relationships that I had, especially earlier on at my church, were lacking to a degree. Right? So I'm not saying that we are doing everything right, and I'm not saying that it's exclusively in the neighborhood aspect. I'm saying this spans everything. Okay, sure. So going to Jordan Peterson, right? We've got 1,000 people maybe. Like that's bigger than most churches are going to have on one get together. Right? So like that's maybe like a next level up. And then the next one from there is like concerts. With COVID, that went down significantly. Mm-hmm. I think that that's not a good thing. I think that you go up, like we've kind of worked our way up the hierarchy here. I think if you continue up, there are certain things where you could say, well, at some point things are going to kind of fizzle out and you're not going to be able to get everyone together. Like, yeah, you're not going to be able to get everyone in a state together, but there are certain things like our state has a particularly large state fair. And yeah, not everyone goes to the state fair and you don't meet everyone at the state fair. But when you go there, you get a serious feeling like, wow, everyone here, for the most part, is, from my state or from a neighboring state real close to a border or something.
We're
They're coming over
in some way.
Yeah, we're all connected in this way. We've got, even if the shared experience between me and other people at the state fair is like they go through the same kind of change of the seasons and they root for the same sports teams as me. Mm-hmm. Right? Even if it's that, there's still a level of like camaraderie amongst people that I think is really critical. Like that's kind of the state level. And then if we go up from there, right, like the national level, obviously, especially in the U.S., you're not going to be able to get everyone in the U.S. together. You're not even going to be able to get, 1 million people together to try and talk about something really. But there are certain shared experiences that people will have across an entire nation, both positive and negative, right?
Well, yeah, like you're talking about patriotism or a sense of national unity over a set of goals or ideals, right? That's the idea that America was founded on, was unity over a set of basic principles of freedom.
Yeah, I mean,
and then within that being able to be like a melting pot, right? Isn't that what they called it? Where people from all different walks of life and all different cultures can come together and, you know, in theory, right, like experience all the same opportunities. And obviously America has not gotten that perfect over her lifetime, but like that's the idea of
Yeah.
being unified on a national level under shared goals and principles. I mean, I think most people, a lot of people nowadays would agree that America is losing that sense of shared value.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would add to that is some of how you foster these relationships is indirect, right? So me fostering a relationship with you is not just, oh, let's sit down and have a discussion about our future. Let's have a discussion about and get aligned on finances or goals for this year, right? It can't always be that. There also has to be some fun to it. We have to go out and we have to go to a concert together. We have to go out and just sit down and have dinner. We have to go out and just go grocery shopping together. Just even
So
working
fun.
on, yeah, but even
Grocery
working.
shopping.
I'm not saying it's crazy fun, but when you're grocery shopping with your significant other, right? You're both kind of relying on each other. Somebody is maybe leading, somebody is working on getting things. You're walking around together, you're observing the world together, right? You're pointing out like, "Oh, look at this silly thing that's over there," or "Can you believe this terrible movie they're trying to sell to people for $30," or whatever the
Yeah,
thing is.
I mean they're doing something together, experiencing something in the physical world more than just, you know, binging the latest Netflix show on your couch after the kids are asleep or whatever.